Hello, life group leaders. We are in the second session, or at least for some people, you're in the second session, maybe some the first. At any rate, we're on lesson 18 of storing through the Old Testament, and we come to a pretty important passage this week. It's one that deals with David. And in thinking about this passage, a little bit of background on it is that the Ark of the Covenant had been stolen by the Philistines. They went to David went to retrieve it, and whenever he did it improperly, not according to the covenant demands that God had made that people carry it. They had actually made this cart for it, which was the improper way to transport it. And as you know, Uzzah tried to steady it whenever the cart shifted. And as a result, God broke out against him and killed him. And so David left the Ark of the Covenant in the house of Obed-Edom. And as a result of the presence of God, which is what the ark represented to the people, it was His presence. The mercy seat was on top of the ark. His household was blessed, and so David goes to return the ark to Jerusalem. So he goes to get it, and this time he makes sure that they're doing it according to the way God has instructed that it be transported. And interestingly, as you look at this passage, and there in verse 12, actually I believe it's in verse 13, those who were bearing the ark, whenever they took 6 steps, they sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal, and kind of symbolically, they'd taken 6 steps, and before they reached on the 7th one, they sacrificed. It's kind of taking a Sabbath, if you will, signifying that God's blessing on this whole journey as they brought the ark back to Jerusalem. And so David is leading this procession. And as he went, he was just so joyful that he began to dance before the Lord. And as you know, Michal, his wife, came or saw him from afar. She, for whatever reason, chose not to go be a part of this, which would have been acceptable if she had been, because there are other female servants there. But anyway, she sees him as they're coming into the city, and it says that she looked out and despised him. Now, possibly her and David's relationship was not the best for several reasons. One, David had replaced her father because she was Saul's daughter. And also, Saul had taken her and given her to another man, and she was his wife for a while, and then David sent for her. And it says that whenever Abner went to get her and bring her back to David, her husband at the time followed them weeping for all the way out of the city, and finally Abner said, "Go home." And so he did, and so possibly she was resentful for him removing her from a place that she wanted to be. But at any rate, she looked down on him and despised him. And so they brought the ark of the Lord back, and he was dancing, and he offered peace offerings, and he was wearing this linen ephod. And he was just so overjoyed, he was dancing before the Lord. So one of the questions in the chapter or in the book this week is about worship. Okay, one of the important questions that's asked here is, what did God think about David's dancing? What kind of worship do you think he wants from us? Now, there's not any indication that God is displeased with that, because David was enthralled in worship of God. Okay, this was not anything inappropriate that David was doing, even though Michal suggested that he had exposed himself. That was not the case, because he was wearing this linen ephod. It was an undergarment that would have prevented that from happening. But what kind of worship does he want from us? Now, there may be a tendency to get off into the idea of dancing if we're not careful. Um, and the reason I say that is because that's what David was doing. And so I don't think the right conclusion that we draw from that is that God wants us to dance in worship. Now, that may be for some people. If they're enthralled, they might make movements that would classify as a dance, but I don't think that's the point of the question. The point is that he wants genuine worship that we give ourselves completely to him. It even talks in here about the greatest commandment. Um, that you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the kind of worship God wants. He wants all of us given to all of Him. And some of the questions in here that I think maybe don't get asked that would be good to be asked is, would you be willing to worship God if it meant that others would look on you and despise you, just like Michal looked upon David? I think we're too worried about what other people think about us whenever we worship. I think that's why more people don't let themselves go. Not saying that we need to get crazy, and I'm not saying that everybody is going to worship in the same way. But at the same time, we need to be willing to give everything that we are, both in a corporate worship setting and in our everyday life, because the love of God is shown not just through a song; it's shown through our lives. And so, I think that's an important question to talk about and think through. Um, and then the other part, which is the majority of the questions, talk about that. Um, is this covenant that God made with David. David wanted to build God a house. The problem in David's mind was here he's living in this luxury and God's living in a tent. But David obviously didn't understand that God's presence was not only, or maybe he did, but he wanted to do something for God, and I think that's an issue that we need to flesh out a little bit with him. Is that, see, God doesn't need us to do anything for him. It's not as if God couldn't have commanded David to build this, palatial dwelling for the ark. The temple that God did instruct to be built was just beautiful, it was magnificent, it had overlay of gold in so many places, and it was very detailed to show the holiness and the righteousness of God and all of these things. But the idea that David needed to do something for God was misplaced. And instead, what happens is God says, I'm going to do something for you. I'm gonna give you one that will sit on the throne forever. And of course, this is the Davidic covenant that God makes with him, that one of his descendants would sit on the throne forever. And I think we need to help people understand, if they don't already understand, that is a prophecy about Jesus. Okay, the only way David could have a descendant on the throne, that his kingdom would be established forever, is by having one that would live forever, having an eternal nature. And so that's pointing to Jesus. And then David's prayer of gratitude here is really amazing. I think that prayer is instructive for us because David begins to pray back God's promise to him. And I think that is something that we should do, is we should pray back God's promises that he has made to us. And, he trusted God, that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. And you see that in his prayer there. And let's talk about, just for a second, David being a man after God's own heart. I've told this to different groups of people, whether it be the Sunday night crowd or a Bible study or whatever. So you may have heard me say this before, but for a long time I thought David being a man after God's own heart meant that he had a heart like God's. He was compassionate, he was loving. And then God showed me through His Word that no, it meant he was pursuing God's heart. He was pursuing the Lord in all things, and so we need to bring that out and help people understand that they can be a man or a woman after God's own heart. They would pursue Him with everything that they are. It doesn't mean they're perfect, but they're following hard after the Lord. And so how do we do that? Flesh that out a little bit with them. And so, what do you think? The last question is, why do you think the commandment to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength is God's highest priority for us? Do you think we can be fulfilled without doing this? Why or why not? Something you can tie this over into the New Testament with is looking at John chapter, I believe it's 13, 14, 15, talking there about that is the highest priority, because whenever you love God, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. See, love is that thing that is our motivation to follow the commandments of the Lord, no matter what those commandments are. And so I think that love is extremely and vitally important. I don't think we'll fulfill the others without that. And ultimately, I don't think the answer to that last question ultimately won't be fulfilled, because we won't have the relationship, we won't have the intimacy with the Lord that satisfies our soul. That's what ultimately we're looking for in all other relationships, is that intimate, soul satisfying love that God gives us and we can have with Him. And so I know this is pretty quick through here, but I didn't want to take more time than necessary. This is a really important lesson because it has that Davidic covenant in there and it points to Jesus. And so make sure we don't leave out that element in pointing that to Christ, because all of this is about Him. So let's remember that. So enjoy life groups this week, and blessings to you.